want to share with you 5 accountability skills that are critical to developing a culture of radical accountability, uh, both for you as the leader, as a locked on leader or aspiring locked on leader, as well as for your team. Now, again, to refresh our memory, we've discussed this in the past. Accountability is the ability to account for our actions. In other words, it's being able to discuss in detail the steps we have taken to affect an outcome. And typically, of course, this comes up when we actually don't achieve the outcome we were hoping for. Yet this is still a skill, whether the evolution you've engaged in is successful or not. And we'll dig a little bit more into that in a little bit. But there are 5 essential steps or skills, I should say, 5 essential skills required if you want to be accountable and if you want your team to be accountable. The first of these is planning. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago in the introduction, that the definition of accountability is our ability to discuss the detailed steps we've taken. Inherent in that is that we've planned out those steps. And that's critical for a few reasons. First of all, it helps us avoid pitfalls. When we plan for things, we're going to have a higher probability of success. And it's not that we're going to account for everything, although depending on the complexity of the evolution, but we are going to account for the major things, which means the things that come up, whatever comes up that we didn't account for, we'll have a framework from which to work from. That's, again, there's an old saying, Eisenhower once said, in combat, I have found plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And inherent in that comment is that act of planning itself gets our mind in the right place. We're starting to think systematically, which means when a problem does occur, when something comes up that we hadn't expected, we're not just flailing. We're saying, okay, what do I need to change? What do I need to deviate from my initial plan instead of starting from scratch? So when we don't plan, now we have to make things up as we go along. And that's a recipe for disaster. That's where the old saw, fail to plan and plan to fail comes from. So number one, we must absolutely have the skill of planning. And planning is a skill. The more you plan, the better you get at planning, which is the other piece of this, because the act of planning sharpens your planning skill. I know it seems a little redundant there. So that when something does come up on the fly, you can plan on the fly because you're better at it. You've done it at least one more time because you did it for this evolution. So again, planning. It's absolutely a critical skill. Once you've planned successfully, and now you've executed the evolution, and I'm going to assume for this conversation that it didn't go as planned. Now we're looking back to figure out what happened. The next skill is courage. Now, many people think that courage isn't a skill, it's an innate ability. It's something you have. It's actually something you can inculcate within yourself. First of all, let's discuss why we need courage as a skill. Courage is the willingness to face our fears, right? It's the willingness to act in spite of fear. And many people think of courage as acting without fear. If you're not afraid, you don't need courage. Without fear, courage isn't required. It's not courageous to walk into a room unless you have some sort of social anxiety disorder where you're afraid of interacting with people. So the requisite to demonstrate courage is to have fear. So what are the kind of fears that come up for people that keep them from being accountable? Well, one is the fear of failure, the fear of failure. If we can't accept failure, then we can't accept the fact that we may have screwed up. We might have made a mistake because most people view that as failure. And I'm going to address that in a little bit too, because I think there's another way of viewing that. Another big fear that people face is the fear of rejection. In other words, oh, this person's a screw up and we don't want to associate with them. That's rejection. Or possibly fear of ridicule. Look at you. You didn't do well. You fell on your face. You didn't accomplish what you set out to do. You're a loser. Those are the sort of, and they're real fears. I'm not minimizing them, but those are the fears that as human beings that many of us face when things don't go right. Or maybe it's internal. Maybe it's less about what people think about us, but what we think about us. It's this feeling of inadequacy. I'm a loser. I'm not going to do it wrong. Right? Well, those are all fears, none of which are true. And I'm going to say that I don't know anyone out there personally. I shouldn't say that. I know many of you personally, but many of you who are listening to this, I don't know personally. And I can tell you right now, with a fact, none of that is true. None of us are losers. None of us are inadequate. And frankly, and we'll talk about this in a minute, none of us ever fail if we follow the processes and steps that I'm laying out here. So have the courage to face your fears. The fears are real. I'm not minimizing them. I am saying, however, that just find the courage. So where do we find courage, by the way? Because it's a skill, but it needs to be practiced. So how do we find it? How do we do it the first time? Because every time you practice courage, you're going to get better at it. But how do we find it? Well, I like to quote Lao Tzu, who is the founder of Taoism. And he once said, being cared for deeply by others gives us strength. To know that people care about us, think about it, gives us strength, right? We feel nurtured, we feel wanted, we feel part of a group. In fact, Maslow talks about that in very need when he talks in his hierarchy of needs, when he talks about esteem. That's really what he's addressing there. Lao Tzu went on to say, caring deeply about others gives us courage. If you doubt this, all we need to do is read through, find some interviews with anybody who has been awarded any sort of medal of valor from the military. And to a person, literally, I've never run into an example where this is not the case. None of them feel like they deserve it. To a person, in one form or another, they all say the same thing, which is, I didn't do anything more than any other member of my unit would have done had they been standing where I was standing at that moment. And I had no choice but to do it for the good of my unit. In other words, they didn't do whatever action, storm that hill, charge that machine gun, whatever it might have been. Nobody did that because they thought, I want to get a medal. To a person, whatever they did because they were thinking about the people in their unit, their comrades in arms, and how if they didn't act, in spite of their fear, some of them were going to get killed, injured, whatever. In other words, the courage came from thinking of others. So as we're thinking about facing our internal fears, about reviewing the evolution that occurred so we can be accountable to see what happened, understand that you, whether you are the leader and boss and in charge or a team member, you are modeling this behavior for others so that they can see it. And by demonstrating courage, you will enable them to be courageous as well. It becomes infectious. And by modeling courage and a willingness to be accountable, others will see that. And others will benefit from being accountable. When you come up with, here's how the steps that I failed at and why, and you improve it, other people will learn from it. So think about the rest of your team when you step up to be courageous. The next skill we absolutely need is the skill of being present. And by present, I mean really being aware of what is going on now without the filter of the past or the distortions of the future. And what I mean by that simply is we frequently lock people in a story because we've seen things in the past and we think this is who that person is, which doesn't allow for that person to grow. Well, they may have grown, but we haven't allowed for that in our mindset. So we look into the past, we freeze that person where they are, and then we start looking for reasons to confirm that. It's called confirmation bias, and how that old person that we perceived of is now contributing to this new situation. And we then tend to blame this other person. We need to see the situation for what it is now. The other piece of this is projecting into the future, where we're looking at things, we're saying, oh yeah, well, this might have happened or this could have happened. Where we start blaming outside influences, which isn't really a projection of what we could have done here. We're not being present to what we do, right? There's an old saying that we can't control what happens to us. We can only control how we respond to it. And that requires presence. That requires the ability to see things for how they are so we can see the best road forward. Now, that has to happen in the real time during the evolution, and that's how we make adjustments. during it, right? And when something unforeseen occurs, right? Some outside influence affects us, but also during our evaluation, we need to be really present as well and see things for how they are, not how we wanted them to be or wish them to be, right? Or hope them to be. The fourth skill we need is equanimity. Now, equanimity means that sort of calmness, that willingness to accept things. And that's a byproduct of being present. It requires more than simply presence. It requires presence along with what I call self-grace. Many people speak about having grace for others, right? Grace, that sort of ability to forgive others. In order to do that, we need to first forgive ourselves. I.e., we need to recognize that one, we are human, which means we're not perfect. We're not omniscient. We can't foresee everything. So even when we planned, more than likely we missed something. Going to happen. Other people have other plans. There's other influences that we are unaware of. We're also, right? So we're not all knowing. We don't know everything that's going around. We've just taken the best information we had available. And we made our plans and we missed something. That's being human. We made a mistake. Okay. Or maybe there was some change that occurred last minute, as we've talked about before, and we adopted to it and adapted our process to it. And yet we didn't see everything. Maybe we weren't as present as we could have been. And so the result wasn't what we had hoped for. That's okay. We are human. We need to allow for that and recognize that. But also understand that by allowing ourselves to recognize that and learn from that, we didn't truly fail. We achieved something. We achieved a higher level of perfection in the next iteration. But that only occurs if we have the courage to face this. Well, it starts off, let me back up. It actually only occurs when we've planned. So we have a framework to evaluate things from. We have the courage and the willingness to face our fears so we can honestly discuss how this happened. We have the presence to see what's truly in front of us. And we have the equanimity to not get super upset about this, but to face these realities with a calmness. And the last and final skill that we need is candor. Because even successful evolutions can be improved upon it. And certainly one of the things I see a lot in organizations that are attempting to be accountable and yet not always achieving it, or to the degree they want to, is they typically are only looking at, quote, the failures. And frequently what they look at as failure is it a failure from the customer perspective? Whoever it is they're serving is the customer. And this could be personal, doesn't have to be business. Obviously, business is where I focus most. But did that person perceive a failure? And if the answer is no, they go, great, we didn't fail. What I submit, however, is that our standards must be higher than our customers. If our standards are always higher than our customers, then we will never let them down. We might let ourselves down if we're candid about it, which is great. Yes, you heard me. It is great because that means we have this opportunity to improve and raise the bar even higher than our customers expect. And by doing that, we tend and will always underpromise and overdeliver, meaning the expectation we set will not only be met, they'll be blown away by it. And this is how we create a culture of accountability, what I call radical accountability. Because now our accountability standards are so high and our skills to achieve them are so sharp that while we are allowing ourselves to improve, we are not disappointing our clients. This is something I learned in the military. Right? In the military, whenever we would set out on a mission, that's an evolution. It's a mission. We have something to accomplish. That's all a mission is. Go out and accomplish some predefined objective. You do this every day in business. You have a mission. The first thing we do is brief the mission. That's the planning stage. We talk about all the things that we expect to happen and how we're going to deal with them. Then we go and fly the mission. We execute the mission. And now things come up that we didn't plan for because, as we say in the military, a battle plan never survives contact with the enemy because they have their own plans. Right? So we go out, we affect the mission. The results are the results. And then we come back and we debrief them. And that debriefing requires all those things we talked about. We need one, the initial plan to look against. We need the courage to face up to what happened. We need the presence to actually see what is going on. We need the equanimity to be able to discuss it without getting emotionally ramped up about it. We need to have enough candor to admit what was going on so that others can learn from it. In engineering, we call this a feedback loop, where we complete the circle, we send a signal out, and did we get the results we want? And if not, we modify it and do it again and again and again. When we do that, when we execute those 5 skills and work on them every day, we now have what it takes to create radical accountability in your team. Join the radical accountability movement. Watch the next video right here and subscribe so you never miss a tactical breakthrough with Locked On Leadership.